like to create some kind of organization or facility that supports conservation by leveraging the combined power of hobbyists to learn more and sort of advance our understanding of the world around us.
In this adventure, I speak with Michael Nash, soon to be MD PhD. Unless you're part of the chameleon enthusiasts, you may never have heard of him. Now, his podcast will be on the Chameleon Academy Network. I will let him tell you about the small chameleons he works with. Buckle up, this adventure starts now.
To the music. Welcome, adventurers. Today we have Michael Nash. Michael, would you introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Michael. Happy to be here. I keep a lot of chameleons, have for a little while now. Love talking about them. Looking forward to everything.
Okay, great. How would you define yourself?
I suppose I'd say just someone who's interested and curious in science and reptiles, animals, medicine. I think I'm just someone who's interested in things and wants to learn more about whatever topic I pick up on.
Notice that you have a lot of different unique reptiles, mostly chameleons. When you get involved in something, would you consider yourself a hobbyist? Do you do this as a way to make money, or what are you?
Yeah, most of my reptile stuff has been as a hobbyist, but because of some background I have, I've also enjoyed sort of taking it to the level of science, right? So, as hobbyists, there's a lot of things we can do to advance science with the things we care about. It just involves some knowledge about how to break into that type of work. So I sort of take a hobby and I try to push it as much as I can to learn as much as I can about it, which often lands me in a position where it becomes science.
So, what was your first exotic pet?
Yeah, I had a leopard gecko as my first
Mhm.
pet, which is a first pet of any kind. I never had a dog, nor a cat, nor anything with hair. It's always been reptiles or frogs, things like that. So I had a really wonderful leopard gecko. I had a second one, and I had some bearded dragons, and then things started progressing more and more and more. And then I had some baby bearded dragons, and everything kind of ballooned out from there.
How old were you when you got your first exotic pet?
I think I must have been 7, max 8. I mean, maybe even younger. Could have been 6. Yeah, 6 to 7, we'll say.
That's awful young, but you took care of it yourself, or
I did. Yeah. I mean, I did my best. It lived for quite some time. I think I had a fish when I was maybe 2 or 3, but that is where I think my parents took care of it a bit. But for the leopard geckos and everything going forward since then, it's been just me.
what do you currently have?
Mostly chameleons. So I
Mhm.
have chameleons of the genus Caluma, Furcifer, Trioceras, Brachysia. I'm hoping to get, or Furcifer, I might have said that already. And I'm hoping to maybe get a couple of more genera if I can, but
Mhm.
I find it easier to describe them in terms of what genus they belong to because all the individuals, it's quite a few.
Mhm.
It involves things like Trioceras ellioti, Furcifer pardalis, just a couple. Don't really breed them much. Furcifer, well, Furcifer minor, Furcifer lateralis, lots of the tiny chameleons, Furcifer campani. I have lots of the tiny Kalumas in particular. So that's like Kaluma Loco, Kaluma lunotum. Uh, I think I have most of the Brachysia available at the moment. So that's Brachysia abenowi, Brachysia stumpfi, Brygui, Decarii, a few others, and some other chameleons mixed in there. I won't list all of them, but uh, I guess I should say the biggest ones I have are Kaluma O'Shaughnessy as well as
Do you have anything other than chameleons?
yeah, I have Theraphosis sturmi, which are the Goliath bird-eating tarantula. I have a few of those. I've produced a number of them. I think some folks who frequent the Chameleon Enthusiast Facebook group actually got a number of individuals from me when I produced them. I also have Caribena versicolor or Antilles pinktoe tarantula, hoping to pair those up again. I've produced a number of them as well. Some various kind of creepy crawly stuff and there's a couple of native Colorado tarantulas that I have on my property as well. So hopefully they'll stick around a bit longer. But mostly chameleons. I've kept a number of things, but that's what I've focused on for the last 6 years or so.
So chameleons and spiders. How did you get to that situation?
Well, it's when I was a kid, I kept a few chameleons, and I grew up in San Diego, so we kept them outside or near the door when I was younger, and I really enjoyed keeping them. It was mostly just Jackson's chameleons, and looking back, I'm sure there were wild caught from Hawaii potentially, but that was really fun. They dropped a litter, and I had some babies that I raised and sold some of them. I was pretty young at that time. I think I must have been 11 or yeah, probably from 9 to 10, something like that. But anyway, I really loved keeping them. They were super cool, really interesting. But I didn't keep them during college, so I had kind of a break where I didn't have any chameleons at all. But I did find it possible to have tarantulas because they're a bit easier maintenance. They Many of them just dig a hole and you never see them. They're kind of a something I've always been interested in. They're fun to keep. They're low maintenance. They're pretty interesting. So as time has gone on, when I got my own place, I got a couple tarantulas to see if I could manage taking care of them. And then I started thinking about chameleons. I think they need a lot of help. We need to learn more about them, even in the wild or in captivity. There's a lot to gain by keeping them and learning about them. So I decided to focus on them. But of course, I always liked tarantulas. Those were the pets I could have when I didn't have the capability of keeping more complex animals.
Yeah, chameleons are very hard to hide when you have the lights and the cage size and all the water and what have you. Tarantulas tend to be able to be in a smaller box and hidden. What has been your favorite pet?
I think I'd probably have to say I really like first for Campani, the jeweled chameleon. They're just I love the colors of them, and they're such a unique looking creature. And the more you look at them, the more you realize just how much is packed into their patterning. And it's I like their personalities. I think they're small and interesting. I've really enjoyed keeping them. The second I'd say is probably Kaluma Row Loco. They're just so tiny. I mean, they're minuscule things, but they're just so stunning. And really, they look almost more like a tropical fish than a chameleon. They don't look quite what you'd expect of a lizard. So those have maybe been my favorite two species I've kept, but my favorite pet I ever had probably was my first leopard gecko. He lived for a very long time, and I loved the personality of him, and he was sort of with me for my formative years of learning about biology, and kind of spurred my interest in, frankly, life sciences and medicine and reptile keeping and all of it. So, single most favorite individual pet, the two species are the two I mentioned before.
So you're proving once again you never get over your first love. Okay,
Yeah.
that's all right. If you could have any legal and allowable reptile or exotic pet, what would you get?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm going to answer that with maybe a few. It's very hard to narrow it down all the
Okay,
way.
most people come up with a list. So
I'll join those ranks, I think. One species that I've always thought was just incredible, I'd love to have a chance to work with them, is Borneo earless monitors. I know a couple of people have kept them, uh, but that is just such an interesting, unique animal, and I think they're somewhat imperiled in the wild, where they are typically. Uh, there's been lots of struggles with reproducing them. They're not very common. I'd love to learn more about them. Just such a unique creature. But as far as exciting other things I really like, Kaluma gallus would be really high at the top of my list. It's this chameleon, very small Kaluma, and the males have this incredible nose, as we call it. I mean, it looks like Pinocchio. It's incredible. The colors are stunning. Really a beautiful little creature. And maybe the next I put on that list is first for Timoni or Timone. I don't know how people pronounce it, but sort of looks like first for Petarai, but it's bright yellow with kind of a a different striping pattern on it in the gravid females. And those last two don't have an export quota, so those will probably never happen. But I just think those are so cool. I just love the look of them, and of course the Borneo earless monitor, just for the um, just the uniqueness of a creature like that even existing.
That's unique. Those are unusual. That no one else has ever said that answer to the question. So you're unique in that form. Most people do have several that they can't choose from, but that's unique. So, what projects are you currently doing with your?
Yeah, so effectively everything I keep, I have intentions of breeding them. The only exception is when I kept a male veiled chameleon, a male panther chameleon, just because they're fun pets to have, right? But um, I I feel most comfortable keeping animals if they're able to essentially complete their life cycle in my care. I feel much better if they're able to reproduce, and I think that helps the species out in many ways. So effectively, every single thing I keep, it's for the purposes of breeding. I find it very gratifying to breed uncommon species and put out information so others can do it as well. And I think that's really doing my best with my capabilities for the animal. Obviously, we need a lot of people to keep the animals, and that's super fun. But just with my interests and what I have available in terms of space and so on, I prefer always breeding what I have, if possible. So all of it.
How do you choose a species?
So it's kind of a complex process. Number one, which maybe isn't the best way to stratify everything, but one thing I do think about is how common is this creature? How available is it? How many chances are we going to get to try to reproduce it? And if the answer is very few, um, oftentimes that makes me want to investigate a little bit more. So with chameleons in particular, there's this constantly changing export import scene, right? As we all know, it's one year all the exports might stop, or one year maybe some species comes in by accident, and it's sort of like the Wild West, and that often makes me feel like, well, okay, these are maybe not going to come in again for a long time. I should look more into this. Maybe I can try to breed them and at least get the information out there if I succeed so other people can try it. So that's one thing. Number two is feasibility for me personally. I think with breeding projects, a lot of my focus is on genetic diversity, as it should be for many people, I think. Um, so I need to pick a species where I can not just have one pair, but I can have a few pairs at the least. Because down the line, I don't want to just produce one bloodline. I want others to be able to work off of that and have at least two distinct different offspring groups that other people can pair up and produce more of down the line. So usually that lends me toward or leads me towards the smaller species because you can establish a more robust breeding population given the smaller space requirements. Something I would love to work with is something like Trioceras melori, which are gigantic creatures, but I need to wait for many years before I can afford a giant zoo facility at my house to house like 10 gigantic Miller's chameleons. So that's not going to happen for some time. But something like a Brookesia, I can get maybe 10 of them, and that's a robust population, and I can offer unrelated pairs and so on. But then, of course, there's the concern about how things might be doing in the wild. And are these breeding efforts going to give us useful information that might have something to do, I'm not sure exactly how, for every species, but might have something to do with how we deal with them in the wild, how we might preserve the habitat, how we understand how they respond to their environment. Because in theory, if we have all of that information, we can extrapolate, well, what type of environment might they need in the wild? What would we have to do for a reintroduction way down the line? What are the biggest risks posed to that species? So, just as one example, in captivity, Caluma linotum can have 5 eggs. However, in the wild, they've only been reported having 2 eggs max. Well, that suggests that there's this degree of real time adaptation that the species can have when it's really exposed to a lot of food and perfect conditions. So it's a little bit nebulous in some ways, but I do think that learning about these species might have some impact on what we do long term with them and what we do in the wild to better keep them around. And that potential is part of what makes me select a certain species. So, long answer, but it's a long process to pick a good species.
So it's your answer. You have to answer it so correctly and honestly. Three main species that we have: the panthers, the veils, and the Jackson eye, can all be kept in a bare bottom tank and go through their whole life cycle. But most of the species that you do follow or breed seem to have the need or something extra, and bioactive seems to be the way you've gone. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So I experimented with bioactive for a few reasons initially, but really eh, there's this important distinction, I think, between naturalistic, so just simply replicating the same environment we might have in the wild for these species, versus using the tools that are available to us to make the habitat the most optimal, right? Ideally, everything we keep is going to be reflective of the wild conditions that the animal is from. But just because of the tools we have available, that's not really feasible, right? I cannot grow a 60-foot tree and put a lizard at the top and put that in my house. It's just never going to happen. So I use the bioactive as effectively a way to give similar environmental conditions under the constraints we have access to. So an example of that, a tree has various microclimates on it. You have under the leaves, it might be a little bit more humid, it might be a little bit less sunny, stuff doesn't burn off as much. Near the top might be warmer. You have 60 feet for a 60-foot tree of microclimates available in different ways everything can move and so on. So, with a bioactive setup, you have soil, which is going to naturally create this humidity pocket near the bottom. Then you have plants growing up at different heights in different directions, which kind of mimics overall what you might see with a tree. And then, of course, you have the temperature and light gradient at the top, which again is sort of a condensed version of what you might see in the wild. So it's not that I believe that everything I keep bioactive naturally lives in the dirt. It's that that setup gives me access to more parameters that can give the animals the conditions I think they require. So some people say, well, this animal lives 50 feet up in a tree for its whole life. It's not really natural to have soil right next to it. But in that case, it's not about perfectly replicating the tree. It's about giving it the environment overall that's going to serve its needs. So it's just been a very helpful tool to accomplish that naturalistic goal I want to accomplish. I can say more about it, but that's my ethos about it.
Would you speak to isopods and other little creatures that are in that soil? Do you keep that stuff? Is that part of your milieu?
Yeah. So again, the springtails are my favorite. The springtails are my favorite because many of the chameleons I keep hatch out exceptionally tiny. Most people, I mean, they wouldn't know what to do with it. It's absurd. They're smaller than a cricket, and most people don't think about keeping things like a cricket as a pet, right? It's usually something bigger. So one needs to change the mindset a little bit and start thinking about things from the perspective of something much smaller than they're used to encountering. So the point of the springtails is to offer food for the most part for these little tiny creatures. It's hard to find prey items commercially available that are that tiny. And so having springtails there is often a good buffer for these things to feed off of. At the same time, of course, they're essential for the bioactive system because they break down waste material. If you have enough of them, they might even churn up the soil a little bit. They kind of keep the system alive. Now, isopods can do the same thing, and I do use isopods sometimes. But I find that even the small ones have the potential to be a little bit more predatory than I'm comfortable with, especially in cases where the chameleon is zero point 0.1 grams. So Isopods are great. They certainly burrow in the soil. They churn things up. They are a great waste cleanup crew. Very helpful. But I've had many cases where they'll eat eggs buried in the soil. They might even come up and nibble on a tiny, tiny chameleon's tail or foot. So I use them selectively, specifically for live bearing chameleons. That's my favorite use case for them because I found that there's few risks of egg consumption, and if most live bearers are at least somewhat big enough where they're not going to be as more as at risk of this accidental predation. But they're a great addition to a bioactive setup. They come with some risks that I've not discovered in most springtails.
Chameleons either be egg layers or live births, and so let's talk about the egg layers. Live births, and obviously they drop the babies and they're about to go about their life and they move on. But these egg layers, do you leave the eggs in the enclosure then? You don't take them out and incubate them in any way?
Sometimes I leave them, but oftentimes the way the bioactive setup is set up, there's times where the chameleon just comes in, lays the eggs without me ever knowing, or it lays eggs and I come back the next day and I realize, oh, this thing is much smaller now. This chameleon, it must have laid eggs somewhere. So there's typically some stage where there are eggs in the enclosure. I'm either not aware of it or I'm not there to remove them. But with that said, initially, when I was learning how to breed a number of these species, and I do it for every new species I work with, I did leave a number of eggs in the enclosure. And specifically, I take half of the clutch, leave them in the enclosure in the exact same spot, and I take half out and then incubate them artificially. And then I use that as a way to compare, well, this is the natural sort of way that they'd be incubating, and then this is my well calculated, sort of measured, timed out way to incubate. And I'd measure, well, did all of them in this group fail to develop? Did all these develop fine? And that lets me know if I'm generally in the right ballpark as far as my incubation parameters. So oftentimes there are eggs in the enclosure, whether I know it or not.
What's the dream? You mentioned when you get far enough in advance to be able to have your own zoo at your home or something like that. Is that your dream, or do you have other stuff that you've got going on that's more important to you?
I have a lot of other stuff going on that I think is very, very important, and it's what my career is, right, and where my future prospects lie. So I can talk about that a bit, but I also have chameleon dreams and conservation dreams. There's already an organization that does a lot of what I'm about to describe, and it's the Responsible Herpetoculture Project. I want to say that that's an amazing organization. I've contributed a number of pieces to them. Maybe in the future, I might join some kind of position there. But on my own terms, what I'm very interested in doing moving forward is sort of there's a few fold to it. So I'd like to create some kind of organization or facility that supports conservation by leveraging the combined power of hobbyists to learn more and sort of advance our keeping, advance our understanding of the world around us. Because if you look at many of the great success stories for animals that are reintroduced to the wild or are endangered and so on, unfortunately, there's pretty limited input given from the private sector, from hobbyists. There's some exceptions, but lots of this conservation work is really limited to what zoos and well-established organizations can provide. And that's a lot of work for them. They're not really equipped to save the whole world, right? Especially when you're talking about creepy crawlies, little reptiles, things like that it's hard to become an expert in. It's hard to learn how to keep them, and the zoos already have their hands full. So I think it's important, what I'd like to do is to generate some kind of consortium organization that lets the public kind of buy into this conservation idea better, and we can learn more if people simply report their experiences about these animals. And so that's broadly speaking something I'd like to do, some kind of nonprofit, but also personally, I'd like to have some land where I have a number of chameleons, lizards, whatever, animals, where I am actively working with the veterinary community in order to learn how to take care of them better. Vet medicine is wonderful. There's somewhat limited funding sometimes. Uh, it's I think there's a big opportunity there to fine tune how we treat and care for exotics. Obviously, people are trying to learn, and there is a big field focused on that. But again, there's not much input from reptile hobbyists. So with some of the science I do, I aim to engage the veterinary community to sort of better learn how these animals fit into our society, how we can care for them better, learn things about them that help make them more integrated in the world around us as we continue to modernize. And then personally, I want to keep keeping reptiles in bigger spaces for the rest of my life for fun. So I have kind of broad goals and ideas, and I hope I'm well suited and positioned to do it. But personally, I want to keep keeping reptiles and learning more about them. So,
That's something I could definitely get behind.
mm.
I'm a little bit ahead of you in years. Hurry up and get it done so I'm not gone when you get it accomplished. But
Oh, it'll be done before that.
this is called the Reptile Show Reporters. What is your experience with reptile shows? Have you been to many of them? Do you go to them?
Yeah. So, well, growing up, I mean, often for my birthday or special events, we'd go to the really big Anaheim Reptile Show in Anaheim, California, and that was so fun for me. I just loved it. It was incredible seeing just things I never even knew to investigate. I mean, 15 years ago or whenever I was at uh, this really big one, uh, there was someone still selling stick insects, big phasmids, and things like that, and I didn't even realize that they existed, or big centipedes, or it just things I didn't even realize could exist, and it was just so exciting to see all of them. And of course, I wanted to come home with some more of them. I always wanted Akimothers. I always saw them at the expos, or the shows. I still haven't gotten them, unfortunately. But big part of my childhood, and it's still something I really enjoy going to. It's just fun, and also just fun to talk with people in the reptile keeping community. I think it's really like an amusement park to me. I really love it. It's just super fun. And as far as my own vending, I have never set up my own. I sell a lot of animals, but I've never set up my own kind of stand or anything. Often, what I'll do is, because I know folks at the expos, I will go there, and because they're in my neighborhood, I'll just ask them, "Hey, I have these animals available. Are you interested in buying them?" And then I might just show up and then uh, sell it to the vendors sometimes, or people I know there, without having a formal stand exactly. And then maybe they'll flip them, or they'll just keep them and try to work with them. So that's often how I'll interact with those shows. But I just like going. It's fun. It's interesting. I like meeting people there and seeing what's available.
So, what would your perfect reptile show be for you personally?
Something very big, with a lot of things that I, again, wouldn't know I'm looking for. So something that maybe even has like an aquaculture component, or fishes, or has more amphibians or something that I have a little less experience with. Although I had a great Pac-Man frog, or a few Pac-Man frogs, but that's beside the point. It's certainly something close by. So if I bought anything, I wouldn't have to transport it very far. I, I like the really big shows, actually, and I think that's because there's often sort of break time built in. There's places you can go and talk with people. It's a bit more quiet, maybe, since there's certain sort of breakout rooms available. Um, yeah, as far as perfect, convenient, uh, and I think I'd like to see some with plants and fish and stuff I don't know as much about, just for my own enrichment.
So, I guess yours would be the size of Tinley, but the diversity of the most recent mega show in Pittsburgh, which had saltwater fish, it had reptiles, amphibians, it actually even had venomous snakes. Most people want a big one with diversity. They also want a local one so they can get their stuff and meet people, and the ones that have just the ball pythons and the crested geckos. Now that's where the leopard gecko's gone to. Now the crested is taking its place. Why don't you tell us about your day job, if you don't mind?
Yeah, sure. So, my day job, I have a PhD in biology, and I'm finishing up my medical school training right now. So that's a dual degree program, and the purpose of it is to train physician scientists. So these are basically people that have the research background, but they also have medical background as an MD. And the goal is sort of to bridge discoveries in the lab, more or less, like bench research in terms of patient care. So bridge the gap between research at the bench, learning more, and actually making better outcomes for your patients. And that's why the entire program exists to begin with. So I'm particularly interested in disorders of the liver and the gastrointestinal system, so like the gut. There's a lot to learn there, lots of sicknesses relevant to it. So that's what I'm going for in my future career. To get there, though, I'm applying to various programs right now to continue the next step after basic medical school training, and that's residency and fellowship and so on. So I'm at that transition point there where I need to find a place where I can spend the next few years or maybe many more doing all of this.
Wow, it's a long road. I did the medical school and residency thing, but I just did the 3 year residency. I didn't go on to specialize. How many years did you take to get the PhD as well as the MD?
For the PhD, it was a little less than four. So
Mhm.
yeah, 3.8 or something, but around
Yeah.
four. And then the med school was four.
They weren't combined at all. They were separate.
They were kind
Wow.
of combined. I mean, the way the program structure is you have a couple years of medical school, you take some licensure exam, and then you do your PhD in the middle, and then you go back to finish med school. And that's changing now. Some programs are doing it differently, but it's somewhat integrated, and they do their best to help you with your research and sort of integrate everything so you're getting a comprehensive view of both of these sort of fields.
Wow. So this kind of doubles back as you could use your science background for the reptiles as well as dealing with the vets. But so why don't you speak more about conservation?
Right. So, I mean, I feel that there's many different levels one can get involved with conservation, and conservation as a concept is really very multifaceted, and it requires engagement at many, many, many levels. So, obviously, something simple is, well, if we stop cutting down forests and we preserve environments, then that's going to help biodiversity, and that is conservation, and that's an easy and effective answer. But the way we operate as a society, I think, makes things a bit more complicated. And there's new sort of ways one can get involved with conservation that don't appear to be the obvious answer on first glance. I think one of these elements of conservation is simply increasing public engagement with the animals and thus the places the animals come from, as far as something in the public eye now that folks might care about. Bill and yourself and a few others I know are really focused on this outreach and teaching people about chameleons, for instance, and that naturally makes folks interested in where are they coming from. So that's things like Madagascar and other spots in Africa, and some other areas. So I think that's really important just to get people aware of these things that are happening all over the world and maybe even in their own backyard. Having that emotional buy-in through animals, I think is very helpful for helping get these bigger initiatives going, like forest conservation, for instance. But at the same time, you also get smaller organizations that go in specifically because, hey, this species needs this land protected. Once an animal gets listed on the endangered species list, there's a lot more stuff available to attempt to keep that animal around. So again, there's this whole mill of public understanding that I think is really important to bolster so we can better engage with these broader projects and get more people involved and interested and people okay with saying, yes, some of my taxpayer dollars or some of my personal funds can go towards this thing. So that's one sort of arm of this public engagement piece. Now, another piece of the conservation picture, as I see it, is learning about the stuff that might be gone and learning how they adapt or how they exist. Because, for instance, if we didn't study something like Furcifer labordi, this extremely short living chameleon species I know you're aware of, um, and we showed up at the wrong time of year to attempt to survey the environment or survey the numbers, there'd be zero because the entire population is underground. If we never looked into that and never learned about that, we wouldn't even know where to begin to put efforts into place to preserve them. So that's another piece of the conservation picture I'm interested in. It's just getting information about how these animals live, how they might be responding to the environment to give us the tools to eventually hopefully do something for their environment and figuring out what can we do for them given their biology. Now the last piece, of course, is funding for preserving habitat, and oftentimes that comes together with sort of buy-in from the local people in the area. So that's a very complex picture that involves lots of politics and lots of moving parts. But going to these places and seeing what's available, what is possible to protect, and how can we get the public, not just here in another country, but in that area, interested in keeping that space around. And again, that's this sort of humanistic approach to this that I think ultimately might lead to preserving that habitat better, or maybe even reforesting areas and adding stuff to restore things as opposed to simply stopping removal of things. So ideally, I need more money, I need more time, as does everybody, in order to facilitate something like a national park or a small park or even a small area of land that's preserved and the people care about it and the people want it to stay that way and there's monetary value in it staying that way, while at the same time getting the public in as many places as possible on board with those efforts, so it's less of a barrier to overcome to preserve and also enhance, if necessary, these environments and these species in the wild. So again, long answer, but there's many levels here to this conservation picture that I'm interested in, and I think working towards each of those has the potential to inform things on a bigger scale.
That's a perfect answer. It's not too long, and I think about what Bill Strand is. He's my co host on the live show on Wednesdays, and what he is. We started with chameleons, and then we learn about plants, and we learn about the environment, we learn about the countries, and we learn about the other animals from the countries, we learn about all the bugs from the countries. You get going, you're like, and then you're like, you didn't even know where a country was on a map for sure, and now you know everything about that country. And it started off for this chameleon. You saw a chameleon, it was cool, and you thought, this, I want one of these, how do I get this? And you might not even be able to get them because the country's closed, like Tanzania is closed, or
Mm-hmm.
Congo is not closed, but it's really dangerous to get anything out of there. Do you have any final words for the adventure?
Well, I think we've covered some pretty good topics. I really appreciate the chance to talk about all this. I think just some parting thoughts. I think curiosity in this hobby can take you really far, and you can do things in this space that you might be surprised by. Simply keeping records of things and looking into all of these different species available, learning more and asking questions about, well, why are we doing things this way? What is the value of trying this one parameter? This experimentation mindset, I think, is very enjoyable. And it's something that really enriches the hobby for me personally. So I think I'd like to encourage people to ask questions about all this stuff and really think more about, why is this happening? Why do we do this? What would happen if we tried it this way? And these questions, I think, might be able to sort of form that base of people I've been talking about this whole time as far as getting the public to contribute to science. And that starts by asking questions and looking into things. and opening doors up. So I just like to encourage that type of thinking because it's been very enriching for me. And I think that has the potential to elevate reptile keeping as a concept, as well as all the conservation stuff I mentioned earlier. So just keep thinking, keep asking questions. I think it's a fun path to go down.
How can everyone get a hold of you? Well, how do they connect with you? If they're excited by all this stuff and they want to get things moving, I know you're busy. You're going to be going into residency, which is crazy. But how do they go about connecting with you?
Yeah, I mean, usually probably the best approach would be Facebook. It- just my name pops up on these Facebook groups, so that's one way. There's also the Chameleon forums, so I'm on there from time to time. I like the Chameleon forums as a platform because the interactions people have there don't go away. They're sort of preserved in an accessible format, so you can search and see the history of the field, basically. So that's another spot. I think I've listed an email on one of Bill's Chameleon Academy website, or not website, pages, podcast pages. That's nashcams at gmail.com. So that's NASH cams. I don't check it all that often, but that's another way one could contact me. I will say that although I like talking about all this stuff, sometimes it will take me quite some time to respond given all the other things going on. But again, I encourage people to be interested and ask questions, review the podcast, look at things. And yeah, those are some ways to contact me.
Thank you for being here today. It's been a pleasure learning more about you. I've learned a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't know before, and I'm sure the adventurers will learn stuff. I'm looking for good things from you in the future, and both in the exotic pet world as well as the medical world. So good luck to you. We'll have to talk to you at some time in the future.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. Always a pleasure. And yeah, look forward to talking again soon.
All right. Thank you.
Please join our Facebook group, Reptile Show Reporter, pictured here. Thanks.